I don't think I could do this anymore. I don't know why, but I'm okay with walking away from this because there's no way I'm dragging down the lake.
He built a 40-year career on one promise: he never stops, no matter what. So when Jon Bon Jovi stood on the Madison Square Garden stage, put his hand over his chest, and told a sold-out crowd he couldn't finish the show, everyone in that building understood they were watching something far bigger than a bad night. This wasn't stage fright. This wasn't a scheduling issue. This was a man whose body had reached its limit in front of 20,000 people, live, in real time, with nowhere to hide. And the story behind that moment goes back more than a decade, through a surgery most fans never fully understood, a marriage that may have saved his career, and a fear he has openly admitted keeps him up at night. Stick with this video, because by the end you'll understand exactly what was happening inside Jon Bon Jovi's throat that night, and why the man who never cancels a show finally had to. To really understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to understand who Jon Bon Jovi has always been to his fans. This is a guy who came up out of Sayreville, New Jersey, a working-class kid who used to sneak into local clubs and eventually talked his way into opening for ZZ Top at Madison Square Garden when he was still basically a teenager. Over the following 4 decades he turned that hustle into one of the biggest rock careers in history, selling more than 100 million records, filling stadiums on every continent, and building a reputation as the guy who shows up no matter what. Snowstorms, injuries, exhaustion, none of it mattered. The show happened. That reputation is exactly why watching him stop mid-song, physically unable to continue, felt less like a celebrity news story and more like watching a piece of your own childhood admit it isn't invincible. Let's start with what actually happened. On July 23, 2026, Bon Jovi was in the middle of a marathon home turf run, 9 shows booked at Madison Square Garden as part of the band's long-awaited Forever tour. It was the 8th night of that stand, and from the opening chord something felt off. Jon's voice, usually a instantly recognizable rasp-and-power combination that carried arenas for decades, sounded thin. Strained. The kind of sound a singer gets when the instrument underneath the performance simply isn't cooperating. Fans who had been to earlier shows in the residency could hear the difference immediately. The band pushed through as many songs as they could. By most estimates it was around 14 tracks, well short of the 20-plus song sets Bon Jovi had been delivering on the healthier nights of the tour. Jon leaned on the crowd more than usual, letting the audience carry entire verses so he could save what little voice he had left. Before the final song of the night, he stopped, looked out at the arena, and told the fans directly that he was hurting and that he needed their help to get through one more song. His bandmates helped him close the show, the crowd sang along to fill in the gaps, and when it was over, Jon hugged each member of the band, thanked the audience, told them not to throw away their ticket stubs because he intended to make the night up to them, and walked off stage saying he felt great and would see them soon. A representative later confirmed that Jon had been dealing with a sinus infection, and that this was what led to the early ending. That explanation is true. It's also, if you know anything about this man's history with his voice, only half the story. A sinus infection can knock out anyone's performance for a night. But for Jon Bon Jovi specifically, any sign of vocal strain carries a weight that has nothing to do with a stuffy nose, because this is a singer who has spent the last several years fighting to get his voice back from something far more serious than a cold. In the hours right after the show, fan reaction online was a genuine mix of heartbreak and admiration. A lot of people who were actually in the building that night said the same thing in different words: it was hard to watch, but it made them respect him more, not less. Nobody walked away angry about a refund or a shortened set list. What stuck with people was the image of a 64-year-old rock star choosing to stand there and be honest with a full arena instead of quietly disappearing behind a curtain and letting a publicist clean it up the next morning. That distinction matters more than it might sound like, because it's exactly the kind of moment that separates a career built on image from a career built on an actual relationship with an audience. To understand why one rough night sent shockwaves through the entire fanbase, you actually have to go back further than most people realize, long before the surgery that eventually made headlines. Jon has talked in interviews about noticing subtle changes in his voice years before anyone in the public knew something was wrong. A little more breathiness than usual. A little less raw power on the notes that used to come easy. For a long time he chalked it up to just getting older, which happens to every singer eventually, and he tried to work around it the way most performers do, adjusting his technique, being more careful with his warm-ups, trying not to overdo it on back-to-back tour dates. He said he tried nearly everything you could imagine outside of surgery to hold on to what he had, from targeted vocal exercises to changes in diet and rest, all in an effort to buy himself more time before having to face what was actually happening underneath the surface. That's really the part of this story that doesn't get talked about enough. Long before the dramatic surgery and the years of therapy, there was a much quieter, much lonelier stretch where Jon Bon Jovi was on stages all over the world doing everything he could to hide a problem he didn't fully understand yet, and doing it in front of audiences who had no idea anything was wrong. Think about what that actually requires. Going out night after night, performing at the highest level in front of thousands of people, all while privately wondering if the one thing that defines your entire identity is slipping away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. That's not just a professional inconvenience. That's the kind of thing that can quietly eat away at a person for years, and by his own account, it did. Then you get to 2022. That April, Bon Jovi played a show in Nashville that would end up being their last performance for 4 years. Jon came off that stage believing he'd given the crowd everything he had. His wife, Dorothea, who has been by his side since they were teenagers in New Jersey, told him otherwise. She had seen him perform at his best for decades, and she let him know, gently but honestly, that this wasn't it. Jon has said publicly that hearing that from her was devastating, but that she was the one person in his life who would never just tell him what he wanted to hear. Everyone else around a performer at that level has an incentive to say the show was great. His wife didn't. That conversation is what finally pushed him to get checked out. What doctors found was serious. One of his vocal cords had essentially withered while the other had compensated by growing larger and stronger, pushing the weakened side out of alignment every time he tried to sing. Jon has described it in interviews as one cord looking swollen while the other had shrunk down to almost nothing, and the mismatch meant his voice could no longer function the way it needs to for a professional singer, let alone a rock frontman playing arenas. Doctors told him some of this decline was a normal part of aging vocal cords, but that decades of high-intensity touring, night after night of screaming out anthems in arenas and stadiums, had sped up the damage well beyond what you'd expect from age alone. What makes this especially hard to swallow is that Jon wasn't reckless with his instrument. He didn't smoke. He didn't have any of the classic bad habits that wreck a singer's voice early. He warmed up before shows and cooled down afterward for his entire career. He'd trained as a vocalist and taken the craft seriously from day one. And his voice broke down anyway, which is honestly one of the more sobering parts of this whole story. Sometimes decades of doing everything right still isn't enough to protect the one thing your entire identity is built on. The procedure he underwent is called a medialization thyroplasty. In plain terms, surgeons placed material inside his neck to push the weakened vocal cord back into a position where it could meet its stronger counterpart properly again, giving both sides a chance to vibrate together the way they're supposed to. Jon has referred to it as something like a facelift for his vocal cords. The surgery itself went well. But a successful operation was only step one. What came after was years of vocal therapy, retraining muscles and technique from scratch, trying to rebuild an instrument that had taken 40 years to develop and had just been rebuilt from a foundation that no longer matched the old one. For a long stretch after the surgery, Jon genuinely didn't know if he'd ever tour again. He's spoken about long periods of doubt, about feeling like he'd find a small sign of progress only to be set back again days later. That kind of 2 steps forward 1 step back recovery is brutal for anyone dealing with a physical setback, but for a performer whose entire livelihood and identity depends on one specific muscle group functioning correctly, it's a different kind of psychological weight entirely. Most jobs give you room to have an off day. A touring rock frontman doesn't really get that luxury, especially not one who built his name on never giving audiences anything less than his best. In interviews around 2024, he was blunt about where his head was at. He said flatly that if he couldn't be the singer he used to be, he'd rather walk away entirely than go out and give fans a diminished version of what they came to see. He compared it to a quarterback who has to know when he's thrown his last pass, and he made it clear he had no interest in becoming the version of a legacy artist who keeps performing long after the magic is gone, coasting on nostalgia rather than delivering. That's a genuinely difficult thing for anyone to admit publicly, let alone someone whose entire career has been built on stubbornness and refusing to quit. It meant sitting with the very real possibility that the story of Bon Jovi might end not with one final triumphant tour, but with an honest admission that the moment had passed. What's remarkable, and honestly one of the more human parts of this whole saga, is that nobody around him walked away during all that uncertainty. His bandmates, drummer Tico Torres, keyboardist David Bryan, guitarist Phil X, bassist Hugh McDonald, and the rest of the touring lineup, kept showing up to rehearsals even when there was no tour on the calendar and no guarantee there ever would be. They stuck around through years of not knowing if the band would ever play a full show again. Jon has talked about how much that loyalty meant to him, saying the sacrifices his bandmates made for him during that period deepened his love for all of them. Even Richie Sambora, the longtime guitarist who left the band back in 2013 amid his own personal struggles, has said publicly that he'd be open to playing with Jon again if his voice came all the way back. That's the kind of statement that tells you how much was genuinely riding on this recovery, for the band, for the extended Bon Jovi family, and obviously for Jon himself. By late 2025, enough progress had been made that Jon felt ready to announce the Forever Tour, kicking off with a run of shows at Madison Square Garden, the same building where he'd opened for ZZ Top as a teenager decades earlier and where he's played some of the most important shows of his career. The tour represented 4 years of rehab, therapy, doubt, and slow rebuilding finally paying off. Opening night, on July 7, 2026, was treated by fans and press alike as a genuine comeback. Jon walked out to a stripped-down, soulful cover before launching into the set, and told the crowd how much he'd missed hearing a live audience after 4 years away. Reviews were honest about the fact that his voice sounded different from the Bon Jovi of the 1980s and that he moved around the stage less than he used to, but the overall verdict was that he could still deliver a full, legitimate arena show. For a guy who 2 years earlier was talking about whether he'd ever perform again, that alone was a genuine victory. Over the first several nights of the residency, the band settled into a groove. Fans flew in from around the world to catch the shows, filling the concourses outside Madison Square Garden with people speaking half a dozen different languages, all there for the same reason, to see whether the comeback everyone had been hoping for since 2022 was actually real. And for those first several nights, it was. Jon worked his way through deep cuts alongside the obvious hits, leaned into the emotional weight of songs that suddenly meant something different coming from a voice that had nearly been lost for good, and by most accounts looked genuinely happy to be back in front of a crowd after 4 years away from the road. The problem is that 9 shows crammed into roughly 3 weeks is a brutal schedule for any singer, and it's an especially demanding one for a 64-year-old vocalist whose voice depends on a surgically repositioned vocal cord holding up night after night. By the middle of the residency, there were already small signs of strain. A couple of the more demanding songs quietly dropped from the setlist on certain nights, shorter sets here and there. And then came the 8th show, where a sinus infection on top of an already taxed voice was enough to force an early stop. Here's the part that actually matters most for anyone following this story. 2 nights later, on July 26, Bon Jovi returned to the Madison Square Garden stage and finished the tour's New York run with a full set, including some of the very songs that had been noticeably absent earlier in the residency. It wasn't the story of a comeback collapsing. It was the story of a singer hitting a wall, being honest about it in front of thousands of people instead of faking his way through, taking the time he needed, and coming back to deliver. That's arguably more impressive than if the rough night had never happened at all, because it showed the recovery holding up under real pressure rather than just looking good in a controlled setting. From here, the tour is scheduled to head to Europe, with stadium dates in Scotland, Ireland, and England still on the calendar, closing out with multiple nights at London's Wembley Stadium. Whether Jon's voice can hold up for that stretch of shows is genuinely an open question, and it's one that only he and his medical team really know the answer to. But it's worth remembering what he said back in 2024, when he was still deep in uncertainty about whether he'd ever tour again. He said he never wanted to be the artist who keeps performing on reputation alone once the ability is gone. Everything about how he's handled this recovery, the years of therapy, the honesty with fans in the moment things went wrong, the refusal to fake his way through a bad night, suggests that promise still means something to him. What makes this whole story land the way it does isn't really about vocal cord anatomy or surgical procedures, even though those details matter. It's about watching someone whose entire identity has been built around being the guy who never quits, having to publicly admit, in front of the exact audience he spent 40 years trying to give everything to, that he simply couldn't finish. That kind of honesty on a stage that size is rare. Most performers at his level would push through, fake it, or cancel quietly with a vague statement from a publicist. Jon stood there, told the truth, asked the crowd for help finishing the song, and then came back 2 nights later and delivered anyway. If there's a real takeaway from everything that happened on July 23rd, it's not that Jon Bon Jovi's comeback is in danger. It's that 4 decades in, he's still willing to be vulnerable in front of the people who made his career possible in the first place, and that might be the most rock and roll thing about this entire story. If you found this breakdown interesting, let us know in the comments what you think comes next for the Forever Tour, and share this with anyone who's been following Jon's comeback, because this story is still being written.